The Sharma family had always been a symbol of peace. Their home, nestled in a quiet neighborhood, was a place of warmth. The house had that familiar scent of spices and fresh tea. The walls were filled with laughter, the sound of children playing. But on that fateful night, something was different. The air felt heavy, thick with unease. It was late, the kind of late where silence takes over. The windows were shut tight, the curtains drawn. Outside, the world seemed to be holding its breath. Inside, a sense of dread hung like a dark cloud. The family had gathered for dinner, but no one was talking. The usual chatter was missing. The room felt colder than it should have. The clock ticked loudly, each second a reminder of the stillness. Then, a noise came from upstairs. A thud, soft at first, then louder. The family froze. Eyes widened. Faces turned pale. The mother whispered, "What was that?" No one answered. Another thud echoed, followed by a scraping sound. Panic began to spread across the room. The father stood up, his face tight with concern. He slowly walked towards the stairs, his footsteps slow and deliberate. Each step creaked beneath his weight. The house felt like it was watching him. He reached the top of the stairs, the air cold and musty. He turned the corner, his breath shallow. What he saw next stopped him in his tracks. The door to the children's room was ajar. The faintest light flickered from inside. He pushed the door open, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was empty. No children, no sound. Just an eerie silence. He stepped inside, his eyes scanning every corner. Then he saw it. A note, stained with something dark. He reached for it, his hands trembling. The note read, "They're watching." His mind raced, but his body felt frozen. He turned to leave, but a shadow moved in the corner of his eye. Suddenly, the door slammed shut. He was trapped. The air grew colder, and a low, guttural sound echoed from the darkness. The father's blood ran cold. Something was in the house, and it wasn't the family anymore. It was something else, something that had taken their place. His heart raced as his hand fumbled for the doorknob. It wouldn't budge. He slammed his shoulder into the door, but it was like hitting a wall. The cold grew sharper, biting through his clothes. The scraping sound from upstairs intensified, now a rhythmic, almost deliberate noise. A whisper floated through the air, so faint it could have been a breeze. "Help!" It was his daughter's voice. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. He shouted her name, but no answer came. Desperation clawed at him. He turned toward the window, hoping to escape. But it was too late. The shadows in the room seemed to shift, darkening, swirling. They were alive. His eyes flicked toward the hallway. A figure stood there, barely visible in the dim light. A tall silhouette, too still, too silent. The father's pulse quickened. He called out again, "Who's there?" No response. Just a deep, unsettling silence. Then the figure moved, slowly, almost unnervingly so. It was a person, but not quite. The shape was wrong, its movements unnatural. The father's blood turned to ice. He backed away, his feet stumbling as the shadow advanced. It was as though the darkness itself was closing in. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and for a brief moment, the room was illuminated. He saw it, a face, twisted, hollow, empty. A smile stretched unnaturally wide across the face. But there were no eyes, just hollow sockets, black and endless. The father gasped, his chest tightening. The creature moved closer, its presence suffocating. "Leave us alone," he managed to croak. But the creature only tilted its head. And then it spoke, its voice a rasping, hollow whisper. Too late. The father turned, his mind clouded with fear. He tried to break through the door again, but it was no use. The creature was already in the room. The walls felt like they were closing in. The house seemed to groan under the weight of the nightmare unfolding. The father knew then that they were no longer in control. The family was gone, and something far darker had taken their place. The air grew thick with a suffocating pressure. The father's breath was shallow, his chest tight with panic. He could hear his own heartbeat, loud and erratic, but there was no escape. The creature stood still, watching him with those empty, dark sockets. It didn't need to move. It was everywhere. The room began to distort, the walls bending as though reality itself was warping. The father's mind screamed for clarity, but there was nothing. Just the overwhelming sense of wrongness. The figure leaned closer, its presence chilling, and whispered once more, "You're next." The father's hand shook as he reached for the phone in his pocket. Desperation clawed at him. But when he unlocked it, the screen was blank. No signal. No connection. It was as if the world outside no longer existed. The creature's mouth opened, revealing teeth too sharp, too long. And then a voice, not from the creature, but from the walls. It was his wife's voice, distorted and unnatural. "Don't fight it." The father stumbled back, his eyes darting frantically around the room. He could hear movement now, scratching sounds coming from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. The family's voices, or what had once been their voices, were now a cacophony of whispers. They were all around him. The figure in the corner let out a low, guttural laugh, sending a shiver down his spine. The father turned, his hands gripping his head as the voices grew louder. "Why did you ignore us?" The whisper came again, from somewhere deep within the shadows. He knew it was them, his family, but they weren't them anymore. The warmth and life he had once known were gone. He stumbled toward the door, now almost impossible to see through the thick, swirling shadows. The whispers continued, each one a cold knife. "No one escapes," they whispered. "Not now. Not ever." The father reached the door handle again, but it was as though the door had fused with the frame. His fingers bled from the effort. Tears streamed down his face. "Please let me out," he cried. But there was no reply. The shadows pressed in tighter, suffocating him. The creature took another step forward, its form stretching unnaturally as it closed the distance. And then everything went still. For a brief, terrifying moment, the house fell silent. No whispers, no shadows, just an overwhelming emptiness. And then, ****. The door exploded open, splintering into pieces. A cold, moonlit wind rushed in, but there was no one on the other side. The house was empty, but the father wasn't. He was gone. The room was empty now, save for the faint scent of decay. The walls seemed to breathe as if the house itself was alive. And outside, the world continued, unaware of the horrors that had unfolded within. But the house? It remained. A silent, sinister witness to the massacre that had shaken the nation. The house stood in eerie silence, as if it were waiting, watching. The moonlight cast long, ghostly shadows across the empty rooms. But something still lingered in the air, something dark. A heavy presence that wouldn't fade. The streets outside seemed unaffected by the horror that had occurred within those walls. People walked by, oblivious to the tragedy that had unfolded. Yet something had changed. A strange feeling began to spread through the town. Whispers of the Sharma family's disappearance were starting to circulate. But no one had any answers. Authorities arrived at the house, but they found nothing. No trace of the family. No sign of the father's desperate struggle. The house itself was untouched, frozen in time. The only thing out of place was the faint, lingering smell of something rotten. They searched every corner, every room. But there was nothing, no evidence, no clues. The house was simply empty. Days passed, then weeks, and still, no one had heard from the Sharma family. The police called it a mysterious disappearance. But the locals, the ones who had known the family, began to speak in hushed tones. They felt it. The house wasn't just abandoned. It was cursed. One night, a curious neighbor decided to approach the house. Drawn by an unexplainable force, he stood at the front door. The cold wind whispered through the cracks in the walls. He felt an icy chill settle over him. The door creaked open on its own. The neighbor stepped inside, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The air was thick, suffocating. The walls seemed to close in on him, the darkness swallowing him whole. And then he heard it, a soft, almost inaudible whisper. "Help us!" It came from the stairs. The neighbor's heart skipped a beat. He didn't move. Couldn't move. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Help us before it's too late." The flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows across the room. Suddenly, the house seemed to come alive, as though the walls themselves were breathing. The neighbor turned to run, but the door slammed shut. He pounded against the walls, screaming for help, but no one could hear him. The house had claimed him, and just like that, the darkness swallowed him whole. Days later, the house was still standing, silent, waiting. No one dared to enter again, but the whispers never stopped. They were always there, a reminder of the Sharma family, and the darkness that now called that house home. The town remained quiet, but the air felt thick with unease. People whispered in hushed tones, their voices filled with fear. The story of the Sharma family's disappearance had faded from the news, but the lingering presence of the house continued to haunt the town. Those who lived nearby swore they heard faint cries in the dead of night, drifting from the house like a chilling wind. No one dared approach it anymore. The property was eventually sold off to an unknown buyer, but no one ever saw the new owners. The house stood empty, its windows dark, like hollow eyes staring out at the world. Time passed, but the fear never faded. The whispers persisted, carried by the wind. And then, one cold evening, a stranger arrived in town. He was a quiet man, with a sharp look in his eyes and a purposeful stride. He asked around about the Sharma family, about the house, but no one wanted to speak of it. The town had learned to avoid it. But the stranger wasn't easily deterred. He tracked down the property, standing at its gates with a solemn expression. The house seemed to recognize him. The wind shifted, and the front door creaked open on its own. With steady steps, the stranger walked inside. No one saw him enter. No one saw him leave. The house had claimed another soul. Days later, the townspeople noticed something odd. The stranger's car, parked at the foot of the driveway, had been left behind. And the house? It was still standing, as it always had. But now something was different. The once quiet town began to feel alive. People spoke of strange dreams, of shadows in their windows, of a feeling of being watched. And every night, just before dawn, a faint whisper echoed through the air. "Help us!" It was no longer just the Sharma family. Something had awakened in that house. Something old. Something far darker than they had imagined. The house had become a place where souls were trapped, where the darkness grew stronger with each passing day. And no one was safe. The town lived in constant fear, the haunting presence of the house always looming. For the curse of the Sharma family had never ended. It had only just begun. As the days turned into weeks, the town's uneasy feeling grew into something more tangible. It wasn't just the whispers now. It was the sense of being followed. Shadows stretched longer than they should have. People who ventured too close to the house spoke of an unnatural chill that followed them, even when the sun was high in the sky. The house seemed to reach out with unseen hands, pulling at the edges of reality. And the dreams, they were vivid, haunting. Every person in town had them. Dreams of dark figures standing at the foot of their beds. Of cold, lifeless eyes staring from every corner. Of an overwhelming, suffocating feeling that made it hard to breathe. In these dreams, the voices grew clearer. The Sharma family was calling, but their voices were distorted, as though something else was speaking through them. Asterisk, help us. Asterisk. One night, a young woman named Priya couldn't take it anymore. She had heard the whispers, felt the shadows creeping at the edges of her vision. Her friends had been telling her the same thing. Everyone had nightmares. Everyone felt watched. But it was becoming unbearable. The town had grown quieter, more isolated. No one ventured out after dark. Priya decided to take matters into her own hands. She walked to the house alone, her footsteps heavy with dread. The wind howled around her, as if warning her to turn back. But she didn't stop. When she reached the gate, she pushed it open. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the empty yard. The door to the house swung open, as though waiting for her. Priya stepped inside, her heart hammering in her chest. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and something rotting, like decay, had seeped into the very walls. She walked down the dark, narrow hallway, her breath shallow. The house seemed to shift with every step she took. Whispers floated around her, so faint she couldn't tell if they were in her head or real. Asterisk, please, asterisk. Priya's fingers trembled as she reached for the stairs. She climbed them slowly, each step creaking louder than the last. At the top, the door to the Sharma family's old room stood ajar. She pushed it open. What she saw froze her in place. The room was untouched, but it felt alive. The air was thick with tension. And then she saw them. The family. They were there. The mother, father, and 2 children standing in the corner, their backs to her. Their bodies were still, unmoving, but their eyes, their eyes were empty star. Hollow, black holes that seemed to stare straight into her soul. Priya opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The family turned as one. Their mouths stretched into grotesque, inhuman smiles. You shouldn't have come. Priya's heart stopped. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch out, moving toward her like living creatures. And then, everything went black. The next morning, the town woke to find Priya's car parked outside the gates of the house. But Priya was never seen again. Only the whispers remained. Louder, stronger. And now, they called for anyone who dared come too close. Help us. But there was no help. The darkness had fully claimed the Sharma house, and it wouldn't let go. The town fell into a deeper, unshakable fear. No one spoke openly of the house anymore, but it was always there, looming in the distance. Every shadow seemed to stretch further, as if the house's curse was growing, reaching out into the town like a dark, invisible hand. The streets felt colder. The days felt shorter. It wasn't just the nightmares now. People began to see things. Figures moving behind windows, eyes staring from cracks in walls. There was a heaviness in the air, a thick, suffocating feeling that made every breath feel like a struggle. But the town kept quiet. People left. Families packed up and moved away without a word. No one dared to stay for long. The whispers of the Sharma family's fate grew louder and more frequent. The house. It had become a place where time didn't seem to exist. Days bled into nights, but the shadows never moved. The house never slept. And then a chilling thing began to happen. One by one, people who had once lived in the town began to disappear. At first, it was small things. Someone's pet missing, a neighbor not answering the door, a vehicle left abandoned on the road. But soon, the disappearances became more alarming. One evening, a group of friends who had gathered at a local cafe talked about the house for the first time in months. They had all heard the rumors. They knew the stories. But they laughed it off, dismissing it as superstition. That was until one of them, a young man named Anil, swore he had seen something. He had driven past the house the previous night, and the lights, flickering like candles in the dark, had caught his attention. He couldn't resist. He turned into the driveway. As he stepped out of his car, he felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like a cold hand had gripped his chest. But it was too late. When he tried to leave, the gates wouldn't open. The house, it didn't want him to go. His friends laughed it off, but Anil's face was pale, his hands shaking. That night, he went missing. The next morning, his friends found his car abandoned at the edge of the driveway. But Anil was gone. The whispers grew louder. They never leave, The townspeople could no longer ignore it. The house had taken another. No one knew how to stop it. No one dared go near it. The darkness was suffocating, and the more they stayed away, the more it seemed to grow. The town became a ghost of itself. Shutters were always closed. The streets, empty. Then one night a storm rolled in. Lightning cracked through the sky, thunder shaking the earth. The wind howled, as if warning of something worse to come. And in the midst of the storm, the house moved. The walls seemed to stretch, the windows bulging as if something inside was trying to break free. The earth trembled beneath it. The wind carried the sound of a shriek, terrifying and inhuman. And in the distance, the people who had once feared the house felt its pull. The town was dying, but no one had the strength to escape. The house had become something more, something ancient. It was no longer just a building. It had become a living thing, a thing that fed on fear. And now it wanted everyone. No one would leave. And the whispers? They would never stop. As the storm raged through the night, the town trembled. The earth groaned, as though it could feel the weight of the house's curse pressing down on it. The wind howled through the streets, carrying with it a twisted, wailing sound. It was the voice of something trapped, desperate, angry. The house, once a place of family and life, had transformed into a twisted reflection of its former self. The town, too, seemed to shift, its people's faces hollow, their eyes distant. It was as though the curse was spreading, wrapping around everything like a suffocating fog. And still, no one dared approach the house. No one except one, a man, who had once been a resident of the town years ago, returned. He had heard the whispers, felt the pull of the house from miles away. His name was Ravi. He had left the town long ago, escaping the memories of what had happened, but something had drawn him back. A feeling deep inside that he couldn't explain. I need to understand. He stood at the edge of the property, staring at the dark silhouette of the house. The windows were black, empty eyes staring back at him, but they were different now. They seemed to glisten with a malevolent hunger. The air around him felt thick, suffocating. Ravi took a deep breath and walked toward the front door. The wind seemed to whisper his name as he crossed the threshold. When he stepped inside, the temperature dropped sharply. His breath fogged in the air. The house was cold, impossibly so, as though it had been waiting for him. The silence was deafening. And then, a sound star. A low, growling whisper like a warning. Leave now. Ravi froze. His heart pounded in his chest. He knew the danger, felt it in every bone, but he couldn't turn back. Something inside him urged him forward. He walked through the house, past the darkened rooms, feeling an unnatural weight in every step he took. The whispers followed him, each one more frantic than the last. Help us. Came the voices, more distinct now, but distant. Ravi reached the staircase, his feet dragging as though the house itself was trying to keep him from moving forward. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch toward him, hungry and eager. He reached the top of the stairs and turned down the hallway toward the room, the same one where the Sharma family had once lived. The door creaked open, and there they were, the family. But they were no longer human. Their forms were twisted, stretched, and warped. They had become something else entirely. Something dark. Their eyes were hollow, like the sockets of skulls, their faces contorted into grotesque smiles. But the smiles didn't reach their eyes. You shouldn't have come. One of them whispered, its voice cracked and twisted. Ravi stepped back, his heart racing in his chest. The shadows around him thickened, closing in, wrapping around him like chains. He couldn't breathe. His limbs felt heavy, as if the house was suffocating him. Suddenly, the whispers became screams, loud, shrill, and desperate. Help us! Help us! The voices of the Sharma family echoed in every direction, as though the house itself was speaking. The walls began to tremble, the floor beneath Ravi's feet vibrating violently. And then it happened. The house groaned, as if it were alive. A blast of cold air surged through the room, knocking Ravi to the ground. He looked up, and in that brief moment he saw it, the thing that had taken over the Sharma family, the thing that had taken over the house. It was massive. Its form was shifting, ever-changing, a dark, shapeless mass of twisted limbs and faces. It was the house. It had become part of it, feeding off the fear and despair of all who had entered. Ravi's scream was cut short as the shadows closed in around him. The last thing he felt was the cold. The last thing he saw was the empty eyes of the Sharma family. And then there was nothing. The house was silent again. The storm had passed, and the whispers continued, louder than ever. The town had become a ghost town. The house had taken everyone, and still it waited for more. Its hunger insatiable, its curse eternal. And the whispers would never stop. The town, once full of life, was now a hollow shell, its streets empty and silent. Those who had remained were no longer the same. Their eyes were vacant, their faces drained of emotion, as though the very essence of their spirits had been taken by the house. The whispers of the Sharma family, along with the other voices of the lost souls, filled the air, growing louder each day. The house, alive with darkness, was no longer just a building. It had become a force, a hunger that stretched beyond its walls. It wanted more, and one by one, the town's few remaining residents disappeared. Some fled, never to return. Others simply vanished overnight, leaving only empty homes behind them. The few brave souls who had once dared approach the house never came back. And then there was the sound. Every night, without fail, the sound of footsteps echoed from within the house. It was as though the very foundation of the building was walking, moving, shifting, changing, as though the house itself was restless, waiting for something more. One evening, the sky was a sickly shade of gray. The air was heavy, thick with tension. And then, at the stroke of midnight, the ground trembled. A deep, unsettling rumble emanated from the heart of the house, vibrating through the earth beneath the town. The whispers reached a crescendo, louder than ever, as though they were calling out, pleading, crying for release. And then, in a single moment, everything went still. The town fell into an unnatural silence, and the darkness seemed to swallow everything. The streets, the homes, the land, they were all consumed by the house. The last remnants of the once vibrant town were now part of its curse. The house had taken everything. Its hunger had finally been sated. But the whispers never stopped, for the house was not merely a place. It was a prison that would never let go. And as the storm rolled in, dark clouds swirling above the ruins of the town, the house stood tall, silent, watching, waiting, its curse eternal, its hunger never-ending. And the whispers? They would continue to echo through the night. For as long as the house stood, no one would ever escape. And the darkness would never cease. The storm raged on, its winds howling like the anguished cries of those lost within the house's cursed walls. The town was no more. There were no lights in the windows, no signs of life. Just a dark, oppressive silence that hung heavily in the air. The once bustling streets had faded into shadows, the houses now empty shells, forgotten by time. The house still stood, its towering presence casting a long, eerie shadow over the land. It loomed like a sentinel, watching, waiting. For what? The ground beneath it was scarred, as though the very earth had been marked by the house's malevolent energy. The once fertile soil was now cracked and barren, as if the land itself had been drained of life. And in the dead of night, the whispers continued. Help us! It was a sound that seemed to come from everywhere, yet nowhere at all. It filled the air, suffocating anyone who came too close. Some said that, on certain nights, you could hear the whispers calling from the edge of town. The lost souls, the ones who had once lived here, now wandered the streets, their forms barely visible, drifting like phantoms. But no one could help them. The house had taken everything. Everyone. It was as if the very town had been erased from existence, reduced to nothing more than a lingering memory in the air. The cursed house stood alone, its hunger satisfied for now. But there was one last detail, one last chilling truth. A faint, flickering light began to appear in the window of the house. Just a glimpse here and there, a glimmer of something moving. The eyes of the house, once dark and empty, now reflected something else. A new figure. A man. His features twisted, obscured by shadows. His movements unnatural, jerky. It was Ravi, the last soul to have entered the house. He had become part of it. His body, his soul, trapped within the house's dark grasp. He stood in the window, his eyes vacant and hollow, just like the Sharma family before him. A cold wind swept through the empty town, carrying with it the faintest sound of a voice. A voice that wasn't just his. It was the voices of all who had been lost to the house. The whispers grew louder, rising into a deafening chorus. And somewhere, deep inside the house, something shifted. It was not done. Not yet. The house was waiting for its next victim. For the darkness had only just begun to spread. The whispers were no longer just whispers. They had become a chorus, a collective, eerie sound that filled the air with an unnatural tension. The town, now a forgotten shell, seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The once empty streets were now alive with movement. Shadowy figures darted in and out of the corners of vision, their forms barely distinguishable from the darkness. They were the lost, the ones who had vanished, swallowed by the house's insatiable hunger. And now, they wandered, forever trapped in a cycle, unable to break free. But the house still stood, watching, waiting, hungry. The wind carried a faint but unmistakable scent, a mix of decay and something foul, something ancient. It hung in the air like a curse that could never be broken. And the house, it was not finished yet. The light flickered once again in the window, a brief flash of life that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the house's beating heart. In the center of it all, Ravi stood. His form was distorted, as though his very essence had been twisted by the darkness inside. He was no longer the man who had once walked into the house. He was something else. His eyes, though empty and hollow, glistened with a strange gleam as he stared out of the window. He was watching, waiting, and then slowly he turned. The house creaked, its timbers groaning as though the structure itself was stretching, awakening once more. The walls shuddered, and for a moment, it felt as if the house was alive, its very bones shifting and changing. A dark energy swirled around it, suffocating the town with an unholy presence. From the darkness, the whispers grew louder, converging on the house, enveloping it. They were calling. They were pleading. And then, from within the house, a figure emerged. It was not a person, but a thing. A twisted, shifting mass of shadows and screams. The form was vaguely humanoid, but its features were impossible to make out. It was as though it had no true shape, no true form, just an endless void that consumed everything it touched. It moved toward the center of the town, its presence sucking the very light out of the air, leaving only darkness in its wake. The ground beneath it cracked and crumbled as if the earth itself was being pulled into the abyss. And the whispers? They had turned into wails, a cacophony of voices, all pleading for release, all calling for help. But no one could hear them. No one was left to hear them. The house had taken them all. The streets were silent once more. But the air was thick with something far more sinister. The curse had never truly ended. It had only grown stronger. The house's hunger was never satisfied. It was a hunger that could never be filled. The town, the people, the land, they were all part of it now. The shadows that had once been whispers were now real, and they would never leave. As the thing from within the house reached the heart of the town, its dark energy swept out, claiming every corner, every building, every soul. And then, the silence returned. But it wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of something far worse. Something eternal. The house had won, and it would never stop. Not until everything was swallowed whole. Until nothing remained but the endless wails of the lost. And the whispers that would echo through the void forever. The town was gone. Nothing remained but an empty expanse of cracked earth and decaying ruins. The house still stood, towering above the remnants of the once thriving community. It was no longer just a building. It had become an entity, a force that fed off despair, sorrow, and fear. Inside the house, the air was thick with the oppressive weight of its curse. The walls pulsed, almost alive, as if the very structure was breathing. Shadows shifted and moved with a mind of their own, twisting around the forgotten rooms and halls. At the center of it all, Ravi's form lingered. He had long since stopped being human. He had become something far worse, an echo, a reflection of the house's twisted will. His eyes were vacant, his body broken, but his soul was forever trapped in the house's grip. And then something changed. A single sound cut through the silence. A voice, low and guttural, whispered from the depths of the house. It's not over. The shadows shuddered, as if responding to the voice, and the walls seemed to stretch in response. The house was shifting, changing, as though it were preparing for something, a final, climactic moment. The door at the front of the house creaked open. No one had entered the house for years. No one dared. But now a figure stepped through, It was a man, dressed in a dark suit, his face hidden beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. He moved with purpose, his footsteps echoing in the otherwise still air. He entered without hesitation, as though he had known exactly what awaited him. The shadows recoiled, drawing back as he approached. The house seemed to recognize him, almost as if it had been expecting him all along. His eyes flickered to the broken remains of the Sharma family, twisted and warped, their forms lost to time. He glanced toward Ravi, whose hollow eyes met his with a quiet, silent recognition. The man spoke, his voice low and steady. Asterisk, I've come to finish this. Asterisk. The air seemed to tremble with his words, and the house groaned, as though it were resisting. But it couldn't stop him. The darkness that had consumed everything could not fight the light. The man moved forward, and the house recoiled. For the first time in years, the whispers grew quiet. And then, as he stepped into the heart of the house, the walls crumbled. The foundation shook. The curse was broken. The house let out one last anguished wail, a final cry of pain and anger, as it collapsed inward. The town, the people, the shadows, they all vanished with it. The silence that followed was final, absolute, and the man, who had never been seen before and would never be seen again, stood alone in the ruins. The darkness had been defeated. For now, the dust settled over the ruins, the air now heavy with the scent of destruction. The town, once consumed by the house's endless hunger, was no more. Its streets, its homes, its people, all were lost to the void, swallowed whole by the malevolent force that had reigned for so long. Yet in the aftermath, there was an eerie stillness. The ground, cracked and scarred, no longer seemed to pulse with dark energy. The oppressive weight of the curse that had hung over the land for years was gone, leaving behind a chilling calm. The man who had entered the house, who had broken its chains, stood alone amidst the devastation. His silhouette, still and silent, was framed by the faint light of dawn breaking over the horizon. His purpose had been fulfilled. The curse had been lifted. But even as the wind whispered through the ruins, carrying with it the faintest echoes of the past, there was something unsettling in the air. Though the house was gone, though the darkness had faded, a part of it lingered. A subtle trace of its presence, a lingering shadow, remained etched in the very fabric of the land. It was as if the house had never truly left. Its mark on the town, its people, its very earth, was too deep, too ingrained to be fully erased. As the man turned to leave, his footsteps slow and deliberate, he glanced one last time at the place where the house had once stood. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper reached his ears. Asterisk, it's never over. Asterisk. A chill ran down his spine, but he did not stop. He knew the truth. The darkness, though banished for now, would always return. The house had been defeated, but it was not the end. It was only a matter of time before the shadows found new ground to haunt. The town had fallen, but the curse, that would live on. For evil, once given life, can never truly die. And so, the man walked away, leaving the ruins behind. The silence settled once more over the land, as the cycle of darkness began to close, only to wait for the next chapter to unfold. The story was never truly finished.